The Montana wind howled like a wounded animal across the McKenna homestead, rattling the wooden shutters and sending spirals of snow through every crack in the cabin walls. Sarah McKenna pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she fed another log into the iron stove, watching the flames dance hungrily against the metal. 3 months had passed since James's funeral, and the silence of the cabin had become her constant companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Through the frost-covered window, she could see her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The winter of 1887 had arrived early and fierce, blanketing the rolling hills in pristine white that stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. Her husband had always said Montana winters tested a person's spirit, separating the strong from the weak. Now, facing her first winter alone, Sarah understood what he meant. The sound of her needle-piercing fabric filled the quiet cabin as she worked on mending a tear in her woolen dress, the same dress she'd worn to James's funeral. Her fingers, though roughened by months of hard work, moved with practiced precision. Sewing had always calmed her mind, a skill her mother had taught her back in Pennsylvania before she'd followed James west, with dreams of building something lasting together. A sudden noise outside made her pause mid-stitch. It wasn't the wind. She'd grown accustomed to its various moods and voices. This was different, deliberate, footsteps crunching through snow, moving slowly around the cabin's perimeter. Sarah's heart quickened as she set down her sewing and moved quietly to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. 2 figures emerged from the tree line, moving with the fluid grace of men accustomed to wilderness travel. Even through the swirling snow, she could see they were Lakota warriors, their long black hair partially covered by buffalo hide caps, their breath creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. One carried a rifle slung across his back, while the other walked with a slight limp favoring his left leg. Sarah's first instinct was fear. The newspapers in nearby Billings were full of stories about conflicts between settlers and native tribes. But as she watched them approach, she noticed something that gave her pause. They moved without urgency or aggression, and the injured one seemed to be struggling against more than just the cold. The limping warrior stumbled slightly, catching himself against a fence post. His companion steadied him with gentle hands, speaking in low tones that the wind carried away before Sarah could discern their meaning. It was then she noticed the dark stain spreading across the injured man's buckskin shirt, not from a recent wound, but from something that had reopened in the cold. Without fully understanding why, Sarah found herself moving toward the door. Every instinct told her to bar it and wait for them to pass, but something deeper, perhaps the memory of her own loneliness, or simply the recognition of one human being's need for help, compelled her forward. She opened the door just wide enough to step outside, the cold immediately biting at her exposed skin. The 2 men stopped instantly, their dark eyes meeting hers across the snowy yard. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind continued its relentless song, and snow swirled between them like a curtain waiting to be drawn. "You're hurt," Sarah said finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. She gestured toward the injured man's arm, where she could now see a long tear in his sleeve, revealing a bandaged wound beneath. The uninjured warrior, clearly the younger of the 2, with strong features and intelligent eyes, stepped slightly forward. "We seek no trouble," he said in careful English, his accent thick but his words clear. "My brother needs rest from cold." Sarah looked at the injured man, noting the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite obvious pain. His sleeve was torn badly, allowing the frigid air to reach his wound. Without a word, she stepped back and gestured toward the cabin. "Come in," she said simply, "before you both freeze." The brothers exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the invitation. The younger one spoke rapidly in Lakota to his companion, who nodded slowly. Together they approached the cabin, stamping snow from their moccasins before entering. Inside the warmth of the cabin, Sarah could see them more clearly. The injured man was older, perhaps in his 40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against sun and wind. His brother appeared to be in his 20s, with the lean build of a man who had never known softness. "Sit," Sarah indicated the chair closest to the stove. The injured man lowered himself carefully, while his brother remained standing, alert and watchful. Without speaking, Sarah moved to her sewing basket and retrieved her needle and thread, then approached the older warrior. She pointed to his torn sleeve and mimed sewing. The man looked at her with surprise, then slowly began to remove his hide jacket. Underneath, his shirt was indeed torn, and she could see the careful bandaging beneath. Someone had tended his wound with skill, but the cold had made the fabric brittle and prone to tearing. As Sarah began to work, threading her needle with steady hands, the cabin fell into a comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. The injured warrior sat perfectly still, watching her face as she concentrated on the delicate work of mending the tear. Her stitches were small and even, reinforcing the fabric so it would hold against future strain. The younger brother moved closer, observing her technique with curious eyes. "You have gentle hands," he said quietly. Sarah glanced up briefly, meeting his gaze. "My mother taught me that mending something properly the first time saves work later." She returned to her stitching, adding a few extra reinforcing stitches at the stress points. When she finished, she tied off the thread and bit it clean, then stepped back to examine her work. The sleeve was now stronger than it had been originally, the careful stitches barely visible against the buckskin. The older warrior examined the repair, running his fingers over the mended area with evident appreciation. "Waist," he said, using one of the few Lakota words Sarah recognized. It meant good. The younger man reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it to reveal a piece of carved bone, beautiful in its simplicity. "For your kindness," he said, offering it to Sarah. Sarah looked at the gift, then back at his face. Slowly she shook her head. "No payment needed," she said softly. "Sometimes we all need help." The brothers looked at each other again, and Sarah sensed a communication passing between them that needed no words. The older man stood slowly, testing his arm's range of motion. The mended sleeve held perfectly. "We remember this," the younger brother said as they prepared to leave. "Sarah McKenna, who mends what is torn." Sarah started in surprise. "How do you know my name?" A slight smile crossed his features. "Small Valley, word travels. You are widow who stays when others leave." He paused at the doorway. "I am Running Wolf. This is my brother, Standing Bear." After they left, Sarah stood at her window watching their figures disappear into the swirling snow. Something had changed in those quiet moments of mending, not just a torn sleeve, but perhaps something deeper. As she returned to her evening sewing, she found herself wondering if she would see them again, and surprised to realize she hoped she would. 3 days passed before Sarah saw any sign of the brothers again. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the morning sun. Sarah stepped outside to check on her small livestock, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air, as she made her way to the modest barn where she kept her 2 horses, handful of chickens, and the milk cow that James had been so proud of. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she pushed open the barn door, expecting to find her animals huddled together for warmth. Instead, she stopped short, staring in amazement. Fresh hay had been spread in each stall, hay she hadn't put there. Her horses, Bell and Thunder, looked content and well-fed, their coats brushed to a healthy shine. Even more surprising, someone had repaired the loose board in Thunder's stall that had been worrying her for weeks. Sarah's heart began to race as she examined the barn more carefully. The water troughs were filled with fresh water, somehow kept from freezing despite the bitter cold. A small pile of split firewood sat neatly stacked near the door, dry wood that would burn clean and hot. Everything had been done with careful attention to detail, as if someone had studied her daily routines and anticipated her needs. Walking back toward the cabin, Sarah noticed other small changes. The path from the barn to her front door had been cleared of snow, packed down to create safe footing. The woodpile beside her cabin had grown substantially, the logs cut to the perfect size for her stove. Most remarkably, someone had repaired a section of her fence that had been damaged in the storm. Not just repaired, but improved, with stronger bracing that would better withstand future winter winds. That evening, as Sarah prepared her simple dinner of beans and cornbread, she found herself glancing frequently toward the window. The work had been done with such skill and quiet efficiency that she might have missed it entirely if not for her keen attention to her property's daily needs. Whoever had helped her possessed an intimate knowledge of ranch work and a respect for her independence. Nothing had been altered unnecessarily, only improved where genuinely needed. The next morning brought fresh evidence of her mysterious benefactors. Sarah discovered a rabbit, already cleaned and prepared for cooking, hanging from a hook near her kitchen door. Beside it was a small bundle of prairie sage, useful for both seasoning and medicine. The rabbit was still fresh, killed that morning, and prepared with the careful skill of someone who understood both hunting and cooking. As she prepared the rabbit for her stew pot, Sarah reflected on the strange turn her solitary life had taken. For months, she had existed in a bubble of grief and determination, focused solely on surviving each day and maintaining the homestead that James had worked so hard to establish. She had grown accustomed to the silence, to making every decision alone, to the peculiar freedom and burden of complete self-reliance. Now, suddenly, she was no longer entirely alone. Someone was watching over her welfare with quiet consideration, asking nothing in return, expecting no acknowledgement or thanks. The gifts were practical rather than sentimental: fuel for warmth, food for sustenance, repairs that would make her work easier and safer. It was, she realized, the kind of help that came from understanding genuine need rather than mere politeness. On the fourth day, Sarah decided to reciprocate in the only way she could think of. She spent the morning baking bread, filling her cabin with the warm, yeasty aroma that always reminded her of her mother's kitchen in Pennsylvania. She made 4 loaves instead of her usual one, wrapping 2 of them in clean flour sackcloth, along with a small jar of the wild berry preserves she had made the previous autumn. As evening approached, she placed the bundle on the tree stump near her fence line, close enough to her cabin to be easily found, but far enough away to avoid seeming like a trap or an intrusion. With the package, she left a simple note written on brown paper. "Thank you for your kindness. You have made difficult days easier." The next morning, the bundle was gone. In its place sat a pair of rabbit fur mittens, beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork around the cuffs. The beads formed a pattern of blue and white that reminded Sarah of winter sky and snow, and the fur was incredibly soft and warm. Beside the mittens lay a small bundle of medicinal herbs: willow bark for pain, echinacea for fighting illness, and sweetgrass for purification. Sarah held the mittens up to the morning light, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship. The person who had made these possessed not only skill, but artistic vision. The beadwork was exquisite, each tiny bead perfectly placed to create a flowing pattern that seemed to capture the movement of wind across snow. These were not quickly made utilitarian items, but carefully crafted gifts that had required considerable time and effort. That afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. She looked up to see a figure on horseback, too distant to make out clearly, but moving with the fluid grace she was beginning to associate with her mysterious helpers. The rider paused at the edge of the forest, and although Sarah couldn't see his face, she had the distinct impression he was watching her with the same careful attention he brought to maintaining her property. Impulsively, Sarah raised her hand in a tentative wave. The distant figure remained motionless for a long moment, then slowly raised his own hand in response. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge being built across the space between them, an acknowledgement of the unusual relationship that was developing through silent acts of kindness rather than words. As winter deepened, the pattern continued. Sarah would wake to find small improvements to her homestead: a loose board nailed down, ice cleared from her well, tracks in the snow showing that someone had checked on her livestock during the night. In return, she left small gifts of her own: fresh bread, knitted items, preserves, and occasionally a simple note expressing her gratitude. The exchange felt like a delicate dance, each participant careful not to overstep boundaries or create obligations. Sarah began to understand that her mysterious benefactors were showing her a form of respect she had rarely encountered. They helped without seeking to control or change her circumstances, supporting her independence rather than undermining it. One particularly cold evening, as Sarah sat by her fire mending clothes and listening to the wind howl outside, she realized that her perspective on solitude had fundamentally changed. She was still alone in her cabin, still making her own decisions and managing her own affairs, but she was no longer isolated. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her windows, people cared about her welfare and took quiet action to ensure her safety and comfort. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes, not tears of sadness but of gratitude for a kindness so pure it asked nothing in return except the opportunity to continue. For the first time since James's death, Sarah felt truly hopeful about her future in this vast, often unforgiving land. The first warm day of March arrived like a long-awaited letter, carrying promises of renewal and hope. Sarah stood on her front porch, breathing deeply of air that finally held the scent of earth instead of ice. Icicles dripped steadily from her roof, creating a symphony of tiny water drops that spoke of winter's retreat. After months of bitter cold and short days, the sun felt like a benediction on her face. She had survived her first winter alone, and not merely survived, she had somehow found unexpected friendship in the process. The silent exchanges with her mysterious neighbors had continued throughout the coldest months, creating a rhythm of mutual care that had sustained her spirit as much as their practical help had sustained her body. As she walked around her property that morning, Sarah marveled at the improvements that had accumulated over the winter. Her fence was stronger than it had ever been, reinforced with careful attention to the areas most vulnerable to weather and wear. Her barn had been subtly improved with better ventilation and drainage. Even her well had been fitted with a new wooden cover that kept debris out while allowing easy access to fresh water. Most remarkably, someone had been preparing for spring planting. Near her kitchen garden, the soil had been turned and amended with what appeared to be rich compost mixed with ash from controlled burns. The earth was dark and fertile, ready for seeds as soon as the danger of frost passed. Sarah had planned to struggle through the difficult work of preparing her garden plot alone. Instead, she found it ready for her efforts. That afternoon, while she was checking on her chickens, Sarah heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up to see Running Wolf riding toward her homestead, no longer moving with the stealth that had characterized his winter visits. Today he rode openly, leading a second horse laden with supplies. Sarah walked out to meet him, her heart beating faster with anticipation and slight nervousness. Their winter relationship had been built on silence and distance. This direct approach felt like crossing into new territory. "Spring comes early this year," Running Wolf said as he dismounted, his English more confident than it had been during their first meeting. "Good for planting." "Yes," Sarah agreed, studying his face. "Someone has prepared my garden very well. I suspect I know who." A slight smile touched Running Wolf's features. "Standing Bear has many skills. Plants grow well for him." He gestured toward the loaded horse. "We bring seeds, corn, beans, squash. Sisters grow together, help each other." Sarah examined the seeds he offered, varieties she had never seen before, carefully saved and selected for their hardiness and productivity. "These are precious," she said, understanding the value of what he was sharing. "Seeds mean survival." "Winter showed us you understand survival," Running Wolf replied. "Your bread fed my family when hunting was poor. Your mittens kept Standing Bear's hands warm when old injury pained him in cold. Now we plant together, harvest together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond its simple meaning. Sarah realized they were negotiating a new phase of their relationship, moving from secret assistance to open cooperation. "Standing Bear wishes to plant beside your fence," Running Wolf continued, pointing toward the southern edge of her property. "Ground is good there, gets morning sun and afternoon shade. He grows corn for your winter. You grow vegetables for our summer. Both benefit." Sarah considered the proposal. Her rational mind catalogued the practical advantages: shared labor, combined knowledge, mutual protection of crops. But her heart responded to something deeper, the offer of true partnership, of belonging to something larger than her solitary struggle. "Where is Standing Bear today?" she asked. "Preparing ground. He comes tomorrow with planting." Running Wolf paused, then added, "He asks permission to build small shelter there, for tools and rest during long days. Nothing permanent, nothing that changes your land." The request touched Sarah deeply. Standing Bear wanted to work alongside her property, but he was asking permission rather than simply taking what he needed. It showed respect for her ownership while expressing a desire for ongoing presence in her life. "Tell Standing Bear he has my permission," Sarah said. "And tell him—" She paused, searching for words to express her gratitude for months of silent kindness. "Tell him that his friendship has been a gift beyond measure." Running Wolf nodded solemnly. "He knows. We both know. White woman who mends torn things without asking payment, who shares bread with hungry strangers, who offers shelter to those she fears. Such person is rare." "I was never afraid of you," Sarah said softly. "You should have been," Running Wolf replied with gentle honesty. "Many of your people would be. Many of mine would not understand what we do here. But Standing Bear says Earth recognizes no color, only those who care for it with respect." The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside her cabin. Looking through her window, she saw Standing Bear directing two younger men in setting up a small, elegant structure near her fence line. The shelter was being built from materials that seemed to blend naturally with the landscape: local stone for the foundation, split logs for the walls, and what appeared to be a roof designed to shed rain efficiently while providing ample shade. Sarah dressed quickly and went outside to observe the construction. Standing Bear looked up from his work and approached her with dignified bearing. He spoke in Lakota, his voice warm and respectful. Running Wolf, who had arrived shortly after dawn, translated. "My brother says good morning to the woman who gave him warmth when winter sought to freeze his bones. He asks if the shelter meets with your approval." Sarah examined the emerging structure. It was beautiful in its simplicity, designed to serve its function without dominating the landscape. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Standing Bear smiled at her response, then said something else to Running Wolf, who chuckled before translating. "He says you must inspect his planting to ensure he does not shame himself before such an accomplished gardener." For the rest of the morning, Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of spring planting. Standing Bear worked with methodical precision, placing each seed at exactly the right depth and spacing. The corn varieties he planted were different from any Sarah had seen, some bred for early harvest, others for storage through the winter, and still others specifically for grinding into meal. As they worked side by side, Sarah began to understand the sophisticated agricultural knowledge Standing Bear possessed. He read the soil like a book, adjusting his planting technique based on subtle variations in texture and drainage. He showed her how to create small windbreaks using native plants, how to encourage beneficial insects, and how to arrange crops so they would support each other's growth. "Your brother is a master farmer," Sarah told Running Wolf during a brief rest. "He learns from grandmother who lived 90 summers," Running Wolf replied. "She teaches that plants are like people. Each has gifts to share, but only if treated with respect and understanding." By evening, the area beside Sarah's fence had been transformed into the beginning of what promised to be a remarkable garden. Standing Bear's corn was planted in precise rows that followed the natural contours of the land, while Sarah's vegetables were arranged in complementary patterns that would maximize both plants' success. As the brothers prepared to leave, Standing Bear approached Sarah and offered her a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside, she found a collection of herb seeds and a carved wooden marker for her garden. "For healing plants," Running Wolf explained. "Standing Bear's gift to woman who heals torn sleeves and wounded spirits." That night, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, she reflected on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone. What had begun as a simple act of mending a torn sleeve had grown into something that felt like family. Not the family of blood and law she had known before, but a family of choice built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more planting, and the continuing work of building something unprecedented, a friendship that transcended the divisions that seemed to separate their peoples. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt grateful to be part of something larger than herself, something that honored both independence and community. The summer of 1887 brought challenges that tested the strength of the unlikely alliance Sarah had formed with Standing Bear and Running Wolf. As their shared garden flourished under the Montana sun, word of their cooperation began to spread through both communities, creating ripples of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, outright hostility. Sarah first became aware of the growing tension during her monthly trip to Billings for supplies. The general store owner, Thomas Morrison, who had always treated her with polite respect, greeted her with unusual coolness. As she selected flour and sugar from his shelves, she overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when the speakers noticed her presence. "Excuse me, Mrs. McKenna," Morrison said as she prepared to pay for her purchases. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but there's been talk about unusual activity at your homestead. Folks are concerned for your safety." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "What kind of activity concerns them, Mr. Morrison?" "Well, there's been reports of Indians seen regularly on your property, building structures, camping nearby." Morrison's tone carried a mixture of genuine concern and pointed disapproval. "Some folks worry you might be in some kind of situation." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice level. "The only situation I'm in, Mr. Morrison, is having the best crop I've ever grown, thanks to neighbors who understand farming better than anyone in this territory." She placed her money on the counter with deliberate precision. "I suggest anyone with concerns about my safety might consider how well I've fared under their protection all winter." The conversation in the store had fallen completely silent, and Sarah could feel multiple pairs of eyes watching her response. She gathered her supplies with dignity and walked out, her head held high despite the uncomfortable awareness that her friendship with the brothers had made her a topic of gossip and speculation. The situation was more complex for Standing Bear and Running Wolf within their own community. Sarah learned about this several days later when Running Wolf arrived at her homestead looking troubled and exhausted. "The council has questions," he told her without preamble, "about why we spend time at White Woman's farm, why we share seeds and knowledge with outsider." Sarah poured him coffee and waited for him to continue, sensing the weight of what he was carrying. "Some elders say we forget who we are, that helping whites makes us weak, betrays our people's suffering." Running Wolf stared into his coffee cup as if seeking answers there. "Others say Earth belongs to all, that wisdom shared makes everyone stronger." "What do you believe?" Sarah asked gently. Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment. "I believe Standing Bear and I judge people by their actions, not by color of their skin. You showed kindness when you could have shown fear. You shared food when you had little. You work beside us with respect, not expecting us to serve you." He looked up at her with clear, honest eyes. "These are not actions of enemy, but others don't see it that way. Some have been hurt too much by whites to trust easily. They see danger where we see friendship." Running Wolf paused, then added, "Just as some whites see danger in us when we mean only good." That afternoon, Sarah was working in her garden when she noticed a group of riders approaching from the direction of Billings. As they drew closer, she recognized several men from town, including Sheriff William Daniels and the banker, Henry Caldwell. Their expressions were serious, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Afternoon, Mrs. McKenna," Sheriff Daniels said as he dismounted. "We need to have a word with you about reports we've been receiving." "What kind of reports, Sheriff?" "Reports about Indians camping on your land, building permanent structures. Some folks are concerned about what that might mean for the safety of other homesteaders in the area." Sarah gestured toward Standing Bear's small, neat shelter. "You mean that tool shed? It's hardly a permanent structure, and it's being used by someone who's helping me farm my land more successfully than I ever have before." "Now, Mrs. McKenna," Caldwell interjected with patronizing concern, "we understand you've been alone out here and maybe you felt you needed protection, but there are proper ways to handle such things. Hiring Indian help without proper oversight could set a dangerous precedent." "Hiring?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "Mr. Caldwell, these men aren't my employees. They're my neighbors and friends, and their help isn't the result of fear. It's the result of mutual respect and shared purpose." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm sure your intentions are good, but you have to understand how this looks to other folks. There's been tension in the territory, and people are nervous about Indians getting too comfortable on white-owned land." "The only thing that should make people nervous," Sarah replied firmly, "is their own ignorance and prejudice. These men have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. They've helped me survive and thrive in ways that no one from town ever bothered to attempt." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Standing Bear and Running Wolf, who approached with careful dignity despite the obvious tension. Sarah noticed that both men carried themselves with quiet alertness, ready for trouble but not seeking it. Sheriff Daniels placed his hand on his gun belt, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. "You boys need to move along," he said with forced authority. "This is private property." "Actually, Sheriff," Sarah said, stepping forward to place herself between the lawmen and her friends, "they're here at my invitation, working on our shared garden project. They have every right to be here." Standing Bear spoke quietly to Running Wolf in Lakota, and Running Wolf translated, "My brother says he wishes no trouble for Sarah McKenna, who has been friend to us. If our presence brings danger to her, we will go." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength of her conviction. "This is my land, and I choose who I work with, and who I welcome here. Sheriff, unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, I believe you and your men should leave." The standoff stretched for several tense moments. Sarah could feel the weight of the decision she was making. Choosing to publicly defend her friendship with Standing Bear and Running Wolf meant openly challenging the prejudices of her own community. But as she looked at the two men who had shown her such kindness, she realized there was no real choice at all. Finally, Sheriff Daniels nodded curtly. "Very well, Mrs. McKenna, but if there's any trouble, any complaints from other settlers, we'll be back with different questions." After the lawmen left, Sarah, Standing Bear, and Running Wolf stood in silence for several minutes, each processing what had just occurred. Finally, Standing Bear spoke in English, his voice heavy with concern. "We bring you trouble, not our intention." "You didn't bring me trouble," Sarah replied. "Trouble was already here in the form of fear and ignorance. All you did was force it into the open." Running Wolf looked troubled. "Maybe we should stay away for a while. Let things calm down." No. Sarah's voice was firm. If we let fear dictate our actions, then the small-minded people win. Our friendship is built on something real and good. I won't let anyone take that away. That evening, as the three of them worked together harvesting the first corn of the season, Sarah felt a deep sense of certainty about the choice she had made. The corn was beautiful, tall, strong stalks producing full, healthy ears that promised abundant winter storage. Standing Bear's knowledge and her own determination had created something remarkable together. As the sun set over their shared garden, painting the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah realized that what they had built was worth defending. In a land where suspicion and prejudice often ruled, they had created a small oasis of understanding and cooperation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. October painted the Montana landscape in brilliant golds and crimsons, and the McKenna homestead had never looked more prosperous. The shared garden had produced a harvest that exceeded even Standing Bear's optimistic predictions. Cornstalks stood in neat rows, their ears heavy with kernels that would provide sustenance through the coming winter. Sarah's vegetables had flourished in the carefully planned arrangement, yielding more food than she had ever managed to grow alone. As Sarah and Standing Bear worked side by side processing the corn harvest, she marveled at how naturally they had fallen into partnership. He showed her the traditional method of braiding corn husks for storage, while she shared her techniques for preserving vegetables in root cellars. Their communication had evolved beyond the need for running wolf's translation. They understood each other through shared gestures, knowing glances, and the comfortable rhythm of working toward common goals. "This corn will feed many people through winter," Standing Bear said in careful English, his vocabulary having expanded considerably over the months of their friendship. "Good harvest brings community together." "Speaking of community," Sarah said, looking up from her work, "I've been thinking about something. The Harvest Festival in Billings is next week. I'd like to enter our corn in the competition." Standing Bear raised his eyebrows questioningly. "Our corn?" "Yes, our corn. The corn we planned together, planted together and tended together." Sarah's voice carried quiet determination. "People need to see what cooperation can accomplish." Running Wolf, who had been listening while he repaired a section of fence, approached them with a thoughtful expression. "Whitetown Festival may not welcome Indian corn. Then it's time they learned something new," Sarah replied. "Fear and prejudice can only survive in darkness. Maybe it's time to shed some light." The morning of the festival dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn sky that made Montana feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Sarah loaded her wagon with the finest examples of their shared harvest: corn with kernels so perfect they seemed to glow like amber jewels, squash that had grown to impressive sizes, and beans with colors she had never seen before. Standing Bear introduced her to heritage varieties. Standing Bear and Running Wolf had initially declined to accompany her to the festival, but Sarah's gentle insistence had finally persuaded them. "If we're going to change minds," she had argued, "people need to see that we're proud of what we've accomplished together." The Billings Harvest Festival was in full swing when they arrived, with booths displaying the year's best produce, contests for everything from pie baking to corn husking, and families enjoying the celebration of another successful growing season. Sarah's arrival with her two companions created an immediate stir. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and curious crowds began to gather around their wagon. "Well, I'll be," said Jake Hendricks, a farmer whose land bordered the festival grounds. "Those are the finest ears of corn I've seen in 20 years of farming." He examined the produce with the expert eye of someone who understood quality. "What variety is this? I've never seen kernels quite that color." "It's a heritage variety that Standing Bear brought from his grandmother's seeds," Sarah explained, introducing her friend with obvious pride. "He's taught me farming techniques that I never knew existed." More farmers gathered around, their initial suspicion giving way to genuine curiosity about the impressive harvest. Standing Bear, initially reserved in the face of so much attention, began to warm to the subject of farming as the questions grew more technical and respectful. "How'd you get the corn to grow so straight and tall?" asked Emma Patterson, whose own garden was the pride of her family. "Mine always seems to lean and tangle." Standing Bear demonstrated the traditional Three Sisters planting method, showing how corn, beans, and squash could support each other's growth when arranged, with proper understanding of each plant's needs. His English, while still accented, proved adequate for sharing complex agricultural concepts, and his obvious expertise commanded growing respect from the gathered farmers. The formal judging began at noon, with local dignitaries examining entries in various categories. Sarah had entered their corn in the general produce competition, but she could see the judges conferring among themselves with expressions that suggested surprise and perhaps some consternation about how to handle such an unusual entry. "Mrs. McKenna," called Mayor Roberts, approaching with what appeared to be forced joviality, "I understand you've brought some interesting produce to our little contest." "I've brought the finest corn grown in this territory this year," Sarah replied evenly, "grown using traditional methods that have fed people successfully for countless generations." The mayor glanced nervously at Standing Bear, then back at Sarah. "Well, yes, I'm sure it's very authentic, but our contest is really intended for local farmers using, shall we say, established American agricultural methods." A murmur of disagreement rose from the crowd of farmers who had been examining the corn. Jake Hendricks stepped forward, his weathered face showing clear irritation. "Now hold on there, Mayor. I've been farming in Montana for 30 years, and I'm telling you this corn puts my best efforts to shame. If we're judging quality, there's no contest here." "That's right," Emma Patterson added, her voice gaining strength. "These folks have figured out something the rest of us are missing. Maybe instead of making excuses, we should be asking questions." The crowd's mood was shifting, and Sarah could see the mayor recognizing that his attempt to dismiss their entry was backfiring. Several other farmers voiced their agreement, and the pressure of public opinion began to mount. "Furthermore," said Dr. Poe, William Hayes, the territory's agricultural advisor, who had been quietly examining the corn with professional interest, "these traditional methods represent sophisticated understanding of plant biology and soil management. Dismissing them would be both foolish and unscientific." Faced with growing opposition from his own constituents, Mayor Roberts found himself forced to allow the judging to proceed normally. When the results were announced an hour later, Sarah and Standing Bear's corn took first place by a unanimous decision, with the judges noting that they had never seen corn of such consistent quality and impressive size. As they stood together, accepting congratulations from the crowd, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond winning a simple agricultural contest. They had demonstrated something important to their community, that cooperation and mutual respect could produce results superior to what either could accomplish alone. Standing Bear spoke quietly to Running Wolf, who smiled and translated. "My brother says this day has shown him something he had not expected. He says white farming community has some members who judge corn by its quality, not by the color of hands that grew it." "And what have you learned?" Sarah asked Running Wolf. "I have learned that small acts of kindness can grow into great changes, just like seeds become harvests." Running Wolf paused, looking thoughtful. "My brother and I came to your cabin last winter, thinking only to rest from cold. We found something more valuable than warmth. We found proof that friendship is possible between people who see past their differences to their common humanity." As the festival continued around them, with people approaching to ask questions about their farming methods and to express genuine admiration for their success, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with the simple act of mending a torn sleeve had grown into something that was changing minds and opening hearts throughout their community. The sun was setting as they loaded their prize ribbons and empty wagon for the trip home. The landscape around them glowed with autumn fire, and the air carried the promise of winter's approach, but Sarah no longer faced the cold months with anxiety. She had discovered that true security came not from isolation and self-reliance, but from the strength that emerged when people chose to trust and support one another. "Next year," Standing Bear said as they watched their long shadows stretch across the golden fields, "we plant more, teach others, share knowledge like seeds, grows best when given away." Sarah smiled, imagining their small garden expanding into something that could feed and connect their entire community. "Next year," she agreed, "we'll show them that the best harvests come from growing together." As their wagon rolled toward home under a canopy of brilliant stars, Sarah knew that they had accomplished something remarkable. In a land often divided by fear and misunderstanding, they had planted seeds of a different kind, seeds of friendship, respect, and cooperation that would continue to grow long after the winter snows had covered their fields. The harvest they had shared was more than corn and vegetables. It was proof that when people chose understanding over suspicion, the results could nourish everyone.